Good afternoon and welcome to the first session of the 9th edition of This is Film Heritage in Practice. I'm Giovanna Fossati and I wear a couple of hats, Director of Collection and Knowledge Sharing here at iFilm Museum and Professor Film Heritage and Digital Film Culture at the University of Amsterdam. This is Film is a collaborative effort that kicked off back in 2015 between iFilm Museum, the University of Amsterdam, and the Amsterdam School for Cultural Analysis. We are excited to have 26 students joining us this year for the series. They'll be assisting in introducing our guests and posing them questions throughout the sessions. As you can see, we are recording these sessions, and they'll be made available on the iFilm Museum YouTube channel, as we've done with past editions. And you can find recordings of the previous 3 editions online. This year's focus is on the theme presenting audiovisual collections, explorations, and experiments. No, the other way around, experiments and explorations, which aligns with the international conference happening later this year. But before we dive into that, let me provide some context about This is Film for those who are new to the series. Through this series, our goal is to delve into the complexities surrounding the collection, preservation, restoration, and presentation of film heritage, all while sharing this discussion with our audience. At the heart of our mission is the belief that gaining insight into the processes of collecting, preserving, restoring films enhances our ability to appreciate and understand them on a deeper level. Much like the appreciation of other forms of art and cultural artifacts, understanding the behind-the-scenes efforts in film preservation allows us to recognize the historical significance embedded within films and the multitude of interpretations that shape their restoration. Moreover, it prompts us to critically assess what has been preserved, what has been lost, and question the reasons behind these decisions. Our series aims to ignite a curiosity that extends beyond what's readily available in cinemas or on streaming platforms, and even beyond what's housed within institutional archives. We acknowledge that archival collections represent only a fraction of what has been produced, and the gaps in these archives are as meaningful as the materials they contain. By peering behind the curtains of Film Archive, we come to realize that film heritage extends far beyond what's accessible through traditional channels. This understanding compels us to seek out films and collections that may still exist but have yet to be made accessible to wider audiences. In our quest for this hidden heritage, we are bound to stumble upon unexpected discoveries, many of which may not fit the mold of traditional theatrical screenings. Indeed, there are numerous projects worldwide that push the boundaries of how we engage with film collections, be it through exhibitions, podcasts, community websites, immersive installations, live performances, and more. Over the 6 sections of This is Film, we'll showcase the incredible efforts of our colleagues worldwide who are exploring film collections in groundbreaking ways. Hence, the theme for this series, presenting audiovisual collections, experiments, and explorations. Today, we'll talk with our guest, scholar and curator Erika Balsom, about the project No Master Territories, Feminist Worldmaking and the Moving Image, an exhibition and film program co-curated by Erika Balsom and Hila Peleg that aims at recovering the breadth of women's contributions to film history in a global context. The conversation and Q&A will be moderated by my colleague Eileen Ye, one of the programmers of the Future at iFilm Museum. So more about today's topic and program in a few minutes. For the second session, on March 20, our guest will be June Giovanni, film curator and founder of the Pan-African Cinema Archive, and researcher Nikolaus Pernetsky. They will talk about the challenges of running a non-institutional archive and reflect on some recent projects, such as the podcast series on African film heritage and restitution. The session will be led by my colleague at the University of Amsterdam, Asli Özgen. On April 3, we invited Brechtje van der Haak, filmmaker and director of iFilm Museum, Marije Meerman, filmmaker, Koos van de Merbel, producer at VPRO, and William de Bruyn, researcher and program maker at VPRO, to discuss the VPRO Archive of the Future and the possibilities and downsides of using AI technology for audiovisual archives. The Archive of the Future project is an online archive that uses artificial intelligence to make over 500 episodes of the VPRO documentary series Tegenlicht, available and searchable in new ways. The session will be moderated by filmmaker Randy Cecchini and will be followed by a screening of the documentary The Price of AI by Marije Meerman. The third session on April 17 will see Irene Hahn, manager digital presentation at I, and Franka Schaap, operational director at Studio Lauter, who will discuss the installation, the Film Catcher. What is the Film Catcher? It's an innovative and interactive presentation of archival films, films from the I collection, and is part of the permanent exhibition here on the ground floor, so at this level. And you are, of course, very welcome to visit it before the session on April 17. For the fifth session on May 1st, we'll have award-winning writer and curator Maya Cade with us to talk about the Black Film Archive, which she founded in 2021. The Black Film Archive is an ever-evolving archive of Black films made from 1898 up to 1999, but it's ever-evolving, so they are adding films as they go, and showcases historically and culturally significant films aiming at making Black film history as accessible as possible. The session will be led by Kate Sacconi, PhD researcher at the University of Amsterdam, and it will be followed by a screening of Naked Acts by Bridget Davis. The last session of This is Film on May 15 will focus on Musidora, a well-known French actress from the silent era, who was also producer, screenplay writer, and director. She, in fact, she directed a total of 10 films, of which most are now lost. Researchers and archivists, Émile Coquille, Marianne Gomez-Rodriguez and Elodie Tamayo will discuss Musidora's legacy, followed by a live cinema presentation of La Tierra de los Toros, modeled on Musidora's cinema performance that will include the tango dancer Veronica Vallesillo. It's going to be very exciting. I don't know exactly what to expect, but I know it's going to be exciting. Also, this session will be moderated by Kate Sacconi. So, as I mentioned earlier, this year's International Conference will focus on the same theme, presenting audiovisual collections, experiments, and explorations. With more than 40 speakers from around the world, the conference will delve into the exploration and experimentation of audiovisual collection presentation. It will spotlight emerging formats that extend beyond the confines of traditional film theaters and curatorial frameworks, fostering novel avenues for public engagement and accessibility. This encompasses immersive, participatory, and multi-screen formats, as well as alternative presentation models leveraging emerging technologies or inventive low-tech and DIY approaches. The 9th International Conference will take place from May 26 to May 28. Registration is open and the program will be shortly available on the website. And now, I would like to introduce Stella Wang, Eline Meinert, Joanna Roche, Zach Tomé, Jamie Yao, who are all students of the This Is Film class, and on behalf of the group, Joanna will introduce our guest.
We are delighted to introduce to you today the multidisciplinary scholar, author, critic, and curator, Erika Balsom. Erika Balsom has a PhD in modern culture and media from Brown University, an MA in cultural studies from Goldsmiths, and is current film studies scholar at King's College London. Alongside her academic work and teaching, she's a critic focusing on film and fine arts, with a vested interest in works that may be deemed experimental. Erika is also a recipient of the Leverhulme Prize and the Catherine Singer Kovacs Essay Award from the Society for Cinema and Media Studies. Her work often focuses on the institutions, habits, and potentialities of the exhibition environment in the cultural field, and how these different fields can be converged. She is the author of Exhibiting Cinema and Contemporary Art, After Uniqueness, A History of Film and Video in Circulation, An Oceanic Feeling, Cinema and the Sea, 10 Skies, a monograph of a James Benning work of the same name, and she has recently written the foreword to Stanley Shinter's Last Movies. Alongside authored works, she has co-edited the books Documentary Across Disciplines, Art is Moving Image in Britain Since 1989, Peggy Awesh, Vision Machines, and Feminist Worldmaking and the Moving Image. Erika is also a film programmer in the bi-monthly film club The Machine That Kills Bad People, and has program screenings on specific filmmakers like Betty Gordon and Peggy Awesh. Today, we'll focus on the exhibition No Master Territories, Feminist Worldmaking and the Moving Image, co-curated with curator and filmmaker Hila Pelek. The title of the exhibition is drawn from filmmaker and writer Trinity Minha's book, When the Moon Waxes Red. Minha's No Master Territories focuses on nonfiction film work and travels dominant notions of aesthetics, approaches, and processes associated with the documentary form, a form or genre that Minha's provocatively claims is not a thing. Minha's focus is on the power of the margins, a space that often one is unjustly condemned to, but can be a site of reframing and reimagination. Balsom and Pelek's No Master Territories takes this idea of the margin and thinks about it within the nonfiction filmmaking context of the 1970s to 1990s. Balsom and Pelek present more than 100 works directed by women from that time period that have become marginalized and don't take up space in the film history canon. The devotion to these often unconsidered spaces of film history that the exhibition provides means not only a deconstruction, but a reconstruction of moving image historiographies and a shift in the historiographical impulse of the moving image. No Master Territories is a show that reimagines the potential of moving image exhibition, both within gallery and cinema spaces. Drawing on the archive and recontextualizing these works, Balsom and Peleg's work looks back to look forward. Curating in a way so as to push against the canon and a center, they adopted a non-chronological approach to the curation of their show, allowing visitors to encounter works intuitively whilst facilitating an environment that was conducive to moving image works. Such consideration is only a slither of the thought and practice indicative of the potential that moving image exhibitions can have in collapsing any attempts at concretizing both the history and future of moving images, art, and the political change that orbits these spaces. No boundaries, no borders, no center. No Master Territories is indicative of a world that perhaps we too can imagine. It is a site of potential that disrupts and explodes predominant ways of being and asks us, as spectators, to participate in imaginations of new and different worlds. Please welcome Erika Balsom.
Hello, Erika.
Hello.
Thank you for coming. So just so everybody knows, we're just going to have a quick chat for 30 minutes. Then we're going to open it up for Q&A for everyone in the audience. And then we're going to watch the 5 selected wonderful films that you have selected for us. So I am very interested in deconstructing this exhibition. And I would just like to start from the inception of it, of how your collaboration with co-curator Hila Peleg began and where this inspiration came from.
Thanks. Thanks for your question. Thanks for this very generous introduction, and to all of you for coming, and to everyone at I for facilitating all of this. I started working with Hila when she was the artistic director of the Berlin Documentary Forum, which was a biannual event that she started at the Haus der Kultur und der Welt in Berlin in 2010. And we worked together on the publication that accompanied the 3rd and final edition of that event. And then after that, over the years, we kept in touch. We co-edited the book, Documentary Across Disciplines, which kind of came out of the Berlin Documentary Forum and drew upon many of its themes and many of its contributors. And then I had this long sabbatical coming up, a kind of sabbatical I will probably never have again in my life, 2.5 years off of teaching. And Hila said, well, we should do an exhibition. And initially, she had an idea to do something around the work of Trinh T. Minh Ha. And the director of HKW at the time said, okay, but, you know, our institution typically doesn't do monographic exhibitions. Because HKW is an institution that was very known for what the curator Anselm Franke has called the essay exhibition, which is a kind of exhibition that doesn't necessarily look at a single artist, a single movement or period, but that instead takes up a kind of essayistic form of thinking. And so the director, Bernd Scherer, encouraged Hila, you know, maybe it's not Trinh T. Minh Ha, but it's a more essayistic exhibition that departs from her work. And so Hila said to me, okay, what do you think it should be? Can you come up with a concept? And we worked together and came up with this initial concept that would involve putting together nonfiction, experimental documentary work by women from the past in dialogue with the present. And initially we thought contemporary artists, new commissions, contextualized with historical materials. But then we started looking in the archives and we thought, okay, no, we are going to really devote ourselves to a historical project. We gave up almost entirely on including any contemporary work. There was one new work in the show, which was Trinh T. Minh Ha's What About China? And so that's the sort of, you know, lingering trace of Trin as the kind of origin point of the exhibition. And we thought it was nice also to keep a brand new work in the show, also to gesture to the fact that, you know, all historical projects are also about responding to the present. And this tradition of feminist filmmaking that we were looking at is one that, is not consigned to the past as a museological object, but is also something that is very much alive and that continues today.
And I suppose because Hila was already working at the HKV, that I'm assuming that institutional support and funding, was that difficult to obtain, or was that kind of already there from the outset?
Yeah, so that was there from the outset. Hila had worked at HKV intermittently for about a decade or a little bit more. And she comes really from a curatorial background with a lot of experience working with artists, commissioning, and producing large-scale exhibitions. That is not my background. I really come much more from the field of research and writing. And so she and I brought very different skill sets, I think, to the project. But from the beginning, after we submitted this initial proposal, all of the funding came from within HKV.
Despite how radical the proposition and the exhibition was, they were still really supportive of it.
I mean, this is a very radical institution. It's for people that aren't familiar with it, it's a multidisciplinary arts institution that is funded by the federal government of Germany. And they have an exhibition making program that I think for a long time now has been really, really pushing the limits of, how we can even think about what an exhibition is in terms of being a place of making public certain cultural practices and certain practices of thinking. And so it's very normal, for instance, at HKV during that time. Now there's a new director, so this is sort of the end of the previous directorship. During that time, it was very normal that there would be no kind of focus on traditional art objects, for instance. Mm-hmm. It was also very normal that there would be a lot of documentation, archival documents on display as a part of exhibitions there. So we were not particularly out there, relative to the kinds of exhibitions that were happening at the institution. But I can say that it was the first time that the institution had devoted an exhibition to gender in any way.
And regarding what you were talking about with archival materials, was it difficult in accessing all of these different archives? Because you were going all around the world.
Well, it was the pandemic. So our exhibition concept was approved in January 2020. Right? 3 months before the world ended. And the show at HKV, which you're seeing slides of here, opened in June 22. And so since then, there have been a few different iterations, but what you're seeing was the first and to date largest presentation of the project. So we had about a 2.5-year period. And we did do some visits in person to archives, primarily in Europe, but we also did a lot of work remotely. We worked together with a network of different archivists, filmmakers, scholars, curators who had specialized knowledge and oftentimes regional knowledge that we didn't. And they were kind of brought together as collaborators or consultants on the exhibition. We did a lot of watching unsubtitled files on Zoom with translators live translating for us to preview works. So it was a difficult and time-consuming process, but we had an excellent team behind us from the institution and also from our group of collaborators. And I think in the end, we worked with archives on 6 continents. And in some cases, these are state archives, but also private archives, informal archives, kind of you name it, looking both for films, but also for supporting documentation. Because as you'll see in the slides, the films in the exhibition, each projection sort of station had a curved surface on the back that we used to display documents that spoke in some way to the lives of the filmmakers and also to the lives of the films. So their production, but also their exhibition and circulation. So we were also kind of collecting different scans that we could show.
And how long did that whole process take?
It was about 2.5 years from the beginning of the project until the opening.
So I guess in that time, did it also kind of change the direction because you had so much more time to collect all the materials that you were researching?
Yeah, I mean, the big change was that we decided to exclude any contemporary material. We often describe the project as ranging from the 70s to the 90s. That's true. That's the bulk of the work, which is also, represented in the program we're seeing today. But in fact, the exhibition has works going back to the late 20s. We have a March 8th animation by the Kodatayev siblings from the USSR, which is 1928, I believe. Also Zora Neale Hurston's field work footage from the late 20s. And then we have a sprinkling of things, leading up to this big explosion of work around the late 60s, early 70s. And then we also have a few things from kind of post-2000s also. So we wanted to keep this sense of an expansive tradition that was not bound by a kind of single beginning and a single ending. Because I think sometimes with feminist historiography, these narratives are told in terms of waves, first wave, second wave. But the moment that you do that, you really inscribe a temporality that is Western European and North American. Whereas if we look globally at feminist activist movements and also at feminist filmmaking, the temporality can be really different. Like in Korea, for instance, the kind of feminist moment really is a little bit later, late 80s, after the transition to democracy in South Korea. In India, very much in the early 80s. Whereas if you're thinking about the US, then yes, the early 70s are very important. So we wanted to have this broad historical sweep. So if anything, to kind of return back around to your question, if anything, I think as we went on, things expanded a little bit. Mm-hmm. We had many works and we really wanted to have an eclectic selection that spoke to the heterogeneity of this field of practice.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm also curious because now that you mention it, you're hopping around 6 different continents and you're collating so many different types of feminist discourse and research materials. When you put the exhibition together, how were you able to kind of tie it all in because they exist in such different cultural contexts as well?
Yes. So, I mean, a potential criticism of this exhibition is that it decontextualizes. We don't have a historical kind of chronological organization. The exhibition was not organized geographically. It has a loose thematic organization, but loose. And in the exhibition design, there's no single path for the viewer to follow. It's really about allowing the visitor to make their own connections across works. And so we hoped that certain constellations would form as the viewer moved through the space. And so there were certain kinds of loose themes that we looked at, including sexuality, images of the body, the environment, internationalist, feminist movements, women's work. And so these can be kind of traced spatially throughout the exhibition. And we hoped that it would be through the accompanying documentation that a bit of the specific contexts could be relayed. But for us, it was really important to present, let's say, a contradictory and heterogeneous account. I mean, there is no such thing as woman's experience. It just doesn't exist. There are many different kinds of experiences. And we really wanted to foreground that plurality. There is, in my view, no such thing as the female gaze, right? So we also really wanted to foreground the plurality of aesthetic styles that feminist filmmakers have adopted over time. I think if you got all these women together in a room, they would not agree on anything. They would not agree on what feminist filmmaking is, what feminism is, what are the most important goals of political struggle, or how to achieve them. But for us, that's what it was about, right? Really, really foregrounding this multiplicity and heterogeneity.
And why, like, going back to what you said, why do you think that the female gaze doesn't exist?
Well, so there have been, I think, recently some attempts to codify something like a female gaze as a set of formal characteristics that a film would have. So, for instance, the film should foreground female experience. The film should avoid voyeurism and objectification. These kinds of requirements that a film has to have, right? Or there's also the idea that by virtue of being a woman, a filmmaker, you know, imbues her film with something distinctively feminine. Both of these positions, I think, are untenable. They fall back in a kind of like rule-based essentialism. I simply don't believe that there is anything we can codify as a female gaze. The male gaze was something that Laura Mulvey described as the product of an industrial system of highly codified filmmaking, which was classical Hollywood. And the moment that we say, okay, we want an opposition to that, let's have a female gaze, we're trapped in a binary, right? We're trapped just in negation, just in opposition. And so I think we need to think about the proliferation of many, many other gazes. And that was something that for us was very important here, to look at works coming from actually a lot of different filmic traditions, some much more associated with visual arts, like kind of two-camera video art works, performative video art works, some coming out of activist traditions, some coming out of avant-garde cinema, the essay film, observational works, portraits, you know, so really a broad array of films that I think in any established histories of cinema would not appear altogether. But we felt that there was a good reason to focus on this umbrella category of nonfiction, which we thought kind of brings them all together. Because I think, you know, we still have, even within women's filmmaking, a very pernicious focus on auteurism. But to be an auteur, how many films do you need to make? 5? 3 at least, you know, probably more. To have a retrospective at a cinematheque, you have to have a body of work, and there has to be a discernible signature across your body of work. And so that immediately is going to disqualify a lot of work by women being foregrounded, exhibited within those institutions. So what if we get rid of the auteur model? We instead think differently. We think about small gauge films, so light video equipment, Super 8, 16 millimeter. We think about short films. We think about nonfiction films. When you get rid of the focus on 35 millimeter feature-length fiction, all of a sudden the history of cinema is full of women, like so many. And so that's also why we included so much work in the show, over 100 works. We could have included many more. We felt, okay, maybe the visitor will be very overwhelmed. It would be impossible to see everything. It would take, I think, about 8 days to see all of the works in the exhibition and in the film program that we did. Of course, no one's going to do that. But I thought, okay, you know, if they leave thinking, wow, there are too many great films to see, that's important because it really pushes back against this narrative of lack, that there are not that many women in established histories of cinema because there just weren't that many women making films. And that's just simply not true. We just have to change our criteria.
And I mean, like, was the audience overwhelmed? Like, how?
Probably. So one thing that's important to say about HKV, we were told by the institution that they had done studies and their average visitor stayed for 3 hours. Now, this is very long, I think, compared to a lot of institutions of contemporary art. And it speaks to the fact that this was an institution that over time had developed a certain relation to its audience, that they knew they were coming for something demanding. So, okay, 3 hours, we thought. Also, all of the tickets were good for 2 entries. So paying once, you can come back twice. A third day of the week was free. So you could essentially have 3 days for the price of 1 visit. And we had a film program running every day from 12 to 8 in a kind of cinema space. And this is where we put longer films and films that we thought really demanded the perceptual conditions and the temporal conditions of the movie theater. And so, yes, it's too much, maybe, but I think, it's not the same as the Venice Biennale showing, 40 Harun Farokhi films at the same time as they did in, I believe, 2016. I have written a lot, and sometimes very negatively, about the poor ways that moving images are shown in art exhibitions. And so I was very aware of all of the problems that occur when you take works made for a movie theater and pick them up and drop them into the gallery space that they were never made for. And so we really thought a lot about what works could benefit from that migration, what works would not, and also how we could ensure that the perceptual conditions within the gallery were such that audiences would be able to still have a good experience of the work, and that it wouldn't become just this kind of like spectacular visual wallpaper. But this idea of overload and there being too much to see, yeah, it's true, but for me, it's also a historiographical principle.
And in terms of, I'm like interested in your methodology of how you decided which works would benefit and which wouldn't. Like, how did you kind of navigate that space?
One very basic thing is length. So shorter works went in the gallery. But, as much as I am really at my core a movie theater cinema person, much more than a visual arts person, the sad thing is that, in fact, works in the gallery would be seen much, much more and by many more people than works in the film program. Even if, it would be better really to see them in the cinema, they would be seen by fewer people. And so there were a couple instances where we had longer works, but we felt people really need to see them, as many people as possible, and so we put them in the gallery anyways. For instance, Sarah Gomez's Mia Porte, My Contribution from 1972, we were the first to show the new restoration of that film, which, one way or another, her feature gets a lot of attention, and rightfully so, but this film, for me, it is just incredible. And so, we put it in a kind of back corner where it was really on its own with quite a large projection, with comfortable chairs. And that way, the exhibition visitors would see it. Whereas in the cinema, it was interesting to note that all of the press about the show, they kind of acknowledged that there was a cinema program, but they didn't write about it. And I think just, in terms of visitor numbers, very few people went to the cinema relative to the exhibition. And it's interesting because the inspiration for this bifurcated model between cinema and gallery came from what for me is a kind of landmark exhibition project, Passage de l'Image, which took place at the Pompidou in 1990. Curated by Raymond Bellour, Christine Van Asch, and Catherine David. They also had this double program. And Bellour told me, at the time, though, all the press was focused on the gallery. And the gallery had many, many more visitors than the cinema program, even though the film program they did was fantastic. It's just what happens when you're working within an arts institution like that. And so we really wanted to think about this trade-off, and the other main thing to say is that the gallery could provide us this chance of showing documentation, which we couldn't do in the cinema. And that was really an important part for us of the project, was to show not just the films, but also all of these supporting documents.
And so looking back, is there anything that you would do differently with how you showcase the exhibition?
I'm not sure. I mean, the interesting thing is that we are still doing it differently all the time, in the sense that when we did this, we knew that this was just the first iteration of something that would continue to live and change. So a year after the Berlin version, it traveled to Warsaw, to the Museum of Modern Art, with no film program and in a slightly smaller space. And so then, we reiterated the project in response to those conditions. And we had a kind of sidebar film program with a documentary festival in Warsaw. And then we've done other sort of cinema-only programs. And so each time there's a sense of, what does it mean to rethink this exhibition for this context? So it doesn't really feel like there's a sort of strong sense of regret of, oh, I wish I could have done this differently. Because in fact, we still can. Yeah. I can say that there was one film that I was desperate to include that we couldn't, which was Arlene Bowman's Navajo Talking Picture, which we just couldn't access in an exhibitable copy. So that's one sort of sad point for me, I guess.
I mean, that's a great sad point, if that's the only sad point. I think what's also really interesting is that, like, when this exhibition took place, it was in 2022, and it also coincided with what was going on in the US with Roe v. Wade. And I was just wondering, because at that time, like, a huge resurgence of feminist discourse also kind of started again, whether it affected the urgency within the audience and also within the exhibition, and how that was kind of speaking to each other.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there has been a really notable resurgence of interest in feminism, both in a contemporary sense and also in the history of feminism over the last 10 years or so. And this project definitely kind of came out of that, thinking about efforts within film culture to revise or explode the canon, but also thinking outside of film culture in terms of a broader relation to feminist politics. And I sometimes had the feeling, both in film culture and in culture more broadly, that there was a sort of amnesia happening, right? So certain debates, for instance, around representation, identity, and power, they're happening today as if there is no history of having thought about these things and debated these things before. And so, in fact, the idea of returning to the work of Trinity Minha was part of this attempt to sort of push back against the short sort of memory or absence of memory, in the present, and to really see that the past is a tremendous resource for us in the present. I also think that there's a way in which looking at various histories of feminisms in the plural can also be a challenge to certain problems with feminism in the present. I think one way of understanding this show also is as a critique of feminism from within feminism. So, for instance, a critique of the idea of just picking a few female auteurs and saying, great, we've done our job. Chantal Akerman is at number 1 of the Sight and Sound list. No. Although we did include her in the show. So, this idea of sort of thinking about what we could call a neoliberal feminism, which really focuses on individual achievement, on the idea of having, female CEOs or a female president, and this kind of elite advancement instead of any real social transformation. I think that is a very dominant conception of feminism in our time that needs to be strongly rejected. And looking at the history of feminist filmmaking provides us, I think, a lot of resources to do that. So this was not a retreat into the past, but really a kind of active homage to this kind of abundance of feminist film history, but also a sense of recruiting the past in the service of the present.
I have one final question for you, because I know we are pressed for time, and I do want to open this up for audiences as well. We have a lot of aspiring curators in the audience, and I know that after the success of this exhibition, it's touring all over the world. Like they said in the intro, that you also have a film club. You've written countless articles and books related to your curatorial practice. So I'm wondering, what do you still find difficult?
Everything. I mean, I don't come from a curatorial background. I come from an academic background. And so, you know, I really see this as grounded in a research-based practice. I think, you know, the idea of curating is something that is just grounded in taste or in picking films. You know, that's like the icing on a huge layer cake of many other things that are much more difficult. And so, you know, actually what I find more difficult is doing that really, really in-depth research, but letting that sort of be so fully metabolized in a way that it comes off with a light touch, right, when it finally gets presented to the public. I find writing very difficult, even though I really enjoy it. But I think that, you know, for me, that practice of research and writing is really what undergirds any kind of curatorial practice that I might have. I mean, I would not maybe self-identify as a curator, even though I curate things sometimes, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm now going to open it up to the audience in case anyone has questions. Please raise your hand. We have microphones running around. Yep, over there.
I have a question which you have briefly talked about throughout your talk. Hackaway is quite interesting and chaotic, perhaps, like too broad of a space to have such an exhibition. How did you approach the structure, and how did you also adapt to the other venues where you had to move the exhibition all over the world?
How we approach the structure, I mean, I think the preliminary thing was this act of bifurcation between the gallery and the cinema. But Hackaway, as you see here, there are no walls in the space. And that means that every exhibition that happens there needs to sort of invent its own architecture from the beginning. If you've been to many exhibitions at Hackaway over the years, you may recognize in our exhibitions elements of scenography from previous shows. So sort of as a sustainability issue, all of the things that constituted kind of the main architectural elements of the show were reused from the storage of the museum. And we thought that this idea of having almost like a media tech study space was interesting in terms of breaking with certain highly spectacularized presentations of the moving image in gallery situations. And so, you know, then it became a question of trying to coordinate kind of light levels, sight lines, and so on in order to be able to ensure a good viewing experience. And I suppose another very important thing to say that hasn't been mentioned yet is that we used this entirely magical sound system where the visitor had one single set of headphones and a device. And when you would approach the wall label for a given work, you gesture toward the label and it gives you the correct soundtrack. And then no matter where you go in the space, you keep that soundtrack with you until you gesture very closely to another sensor point. And so that meant that there was no sound bleed, right? And there was no interference between screens in terms of soundtracks. We had only one work with open sound in the whole space, which was Mona Hatoum's There's So Much I Want to Say, which we took as a sort of, statement for the exhibition as a whole. There's so much I want to say. There's so much I want to say. When we moved to other spaces, such as in Warsaw, we continued this idea of reusing things from their storage. So that was similar, and we also reused these stations with the curved MDF. So all of it was literally put on a truck from Berlin to Warsaw. So in terms of the exhibition architecture, it was actually quite modest and economic. In the other places, we've done really film programs. And so then this question of the use of space is not really so relevant.
Hi, I would be interested in knowing more from your, if you could elaborate more on what the idea of migration, what films, let's say, would migrate better from cinema to exhibition space. I'm curious to hear more about that, apart from the length, of course.
I think it's the experimental filmmaker Morgan Fisher, who made this distinction between teleological films and non-teleological films. And this is a distinction I like because, any film made for a cinema context has a beginning, middle, and end. But I think what Fisher means with this distinction is that, some of them still are not so teleological, and they can be encountered beginning at any point, and they can kind of be more amenable to a loop situation. And so that was one thing that we really considered here. Are there films that need really to be seen from the beginning or else, or can they withstand, a viewer who comes in partway through? So that's one issue. Another issue, though, I would say has to do with the content of certain films. So, for instance, a very key work for us was Byung Young-ju's The Murmuring, which is a South Korean film that was shot in a house in Seoul where a group of elderly women live together, and they're all survivors of forced sexual slavery in World War II. And so, we did not feel that it would be appropriate to have someone stumble upon this work in the middle of a larger exhibition. I mean, the film is very careful also in terms of its structuring of the women's testimonies. And so that was something for us that was very clear. We would love as many people to see it as possible, but it must go in the cinema. And I think, as I said, I have written some very, very negative things criticizing people, curators, exhibitions who have, imported things into the gallery. And I was like, oh, now I'm doing it, And I think at the end of the day, often it is just better to see things in a cinema. But, we have to think about the institutional ecology that exists. I don't think a Cinematheque would ever originate a project like this. It's not a coincidence, I think, that it comes from the side of contemporary art. And I also think that the ability to exhibit documentation alongside the films was something that, for me, made it more interesting. I'm not one of those people who would ever make an argument like, oh, but isn't it great that you can look at all the screens and see all the connections between them? I mean, yeah, you can, but sometimes it's better just to pay attention to one thing. No? And this is what I mean when I say I'm really a cinema person at my core. So I'm the first person to acknowledge the huge compromise that happens when you make this migration. But I do think there are benefits. And I think that, the number of people who saw this show and the kinds of people who came, many very young women came, I just don't think they would necessarily be buying tickets to see the equivalent film series. But they were, coming and just kind of exploring, this space for many hours. And that was very, very inspiring to me.
Thank you for the talk, or for the interview. You spoke a lot about the decontextualization, and coming from a research and academic background where your audience, your colleagues, the readers of your work have so much context, and then moving into a public gallery with a completely different audience. Do you think there are benefits to decontextualization, or does it open avenues for you as a curator to see how new interactions works with a different kind of audience in this work?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I just kind of made this joke about the soft montage and making connections between screens and how I'm not so much of a believer in it, but it also is true, and it does happen. And I think it's interesting, even in the program of films that we'll watch in a moment, these are films made in very, very different contexts, different places, but you can see that there are certain kind of threads that run across all of them, and making those kind of international, transversal connections, I think, can also yield something very, very interesting. And I think, in terms of speaking about academic research, I think, academics often, there are people who are very much like devoted to hardcore archival research, but I think a lot of academics, tend to work on the same available titles, right? And so even the idea of presenting for an academic public as well an expanded array of works, I think has a certain value. We had new digitizations made of certain films that had never been digitized before. We had subtitles made of many films that had never been subtitled into English before. So there's also this act of making public, right, that exists in something like this, that hopefully now those works will be more known and people will kind of become interested in them and do really deep research on them. And I can say, for myself, this is the case, that I did this kind of wide sweeping research that resulted in this exhibition, but now I'm writing a chapter that is a very, very, very deep dive on one of the works that we showed in the exhibition, Un processo per stupro, A Trial for Rape, which is a collectively made film made in Rome in 1979. So, I think there's a sense that this is like a vast array of works, most of which were not super well known, even by people who are very invested in feminist filmmaking. We kind of went out of our way to not show the obvious things or the obvious people. So even, Ulrike Oettinger, Maya Deren, Chantal Ackerman, they're all there, but they're not the stars of this show, actually, in terms of the real estate. Within the exhibition, we really wanted to try again and foreground this idea of abundance, and that there are so many people whose works are just not circulating, but should, and maybe now are starting to circulate more.
Unfortunately, that is all that we have time for the Q&A. But please help me in thanking Erika today for this wonderful discussion. And I know that now we are about to watch the fantastic films that you have selected. Could you tell us a little bit more about them, please?
I'll be quite brief. So we're going to see a program of 5 short films. The first of them is Untitled 77A by Han Ok-hee, made in 1977 as a part of an amateur filmmaking group called the Kaidu Club. That was a group of university students who made films, also organized symposia, wrote criticism. And this is a film that was very important for us because you could almost call it like Woman with a Movie Camera, in the sense that it really dramatizes this act of seizing a 16mm camera and kind of going out on the street and trying to make different kinds of images. And I think we see in this film very clearly that feminist cinema is about creativity, but also maybe about destruction and taking apart certain kinds of dominant images in order to then build something else. Then we will see Smearguns by Gunvor Nelson and Dorothy Wiley from 1965. This is a film that has a very kind of dynamic, poppy montage aesthetic where we see a juxtaposition between the kind of gritty, everyday reality of women's lives and this perfected, glossy image coming out of the mass media. And this, I think, is an important film in that it takes up a theme that was very strong for us throughout the exhibition and throughout a lot of feminist filmmaking practice more generally, which is this idea of a critique of mass media images of female beauty. The third film is Up Against the Wall, Miss America by the Newsreel Collective. And this film actually has a direct connection to the previous film, Smearguns. Smearguns circulated on 16 millimeter and was shown in an office building after hours where a feminist consciousness raising group in New York was having a meeting. And the women were so galvanized by what they saw that they decided to protest the Miss America pageant that was happening in Atlantic City. And so the Newsreel Collective made this document of their protest action. Then we will see We Aim to Please from 1976 by Robin Laurie and Margot Nash. This is a film from Australia. The filmmakers always emphasized that they had never read visual pleasure and narrative cinema when they made this film, but they realized that there are lots of parallels, and they do cite John Berger's ways of seeing in the film. And this film, I think, is interesting in that prior to the last couple years, the exhibition history outside Australia was almost nothing. There's a list on Margot Nash's website if you want to see. There were a handful of screenings. And for me, this is an interesting example of how an exhibition project like ours would never have been possible prior to digitization, because we just wouldn't be able to preview 16 millimeter prints from all over the world to then decide what to show. Whereas now, it's very relatively easy to engage in this kind of transnational comparative research. And then the last and the longest film of the program is Miss Universe in Peru by the Grupo Chasqui, a group of filmmakers working in Lima. This was made in 1982, and it looks at two events happening in Lima that year: the Miss Universe pageant on the one hand, and a conference of a radical peasants organization on the other. And this film, I think, is so brilliant for so many reasons, but one of them is that I would say the film's critique of the Miss Universe pageant is primarily not a critique of, female beauty for a male gaze. It is that, but more than that, it's a critique of the Miss Universe pageant as a kind of form of imperial power that intersects with an ongoing history of settler colonialism in Peru. And so I think it's a film that really adds a very intersectional dimension to the more single issue critique of beauty that we find in Smearguns. So I think it's quite an interesting intervention in this ongoing critique of the beauty pageant, which in a way is the sort of theme of the whole program. So thank you so much. I hope you enjoy the films.
Thank you. And thank you so much to the organizers, to the amazing camera people as well. They're just going to need a minute to sit down, and then we're going to start the projections. And yeah, again, thank you so much, Erika Balsom, for being here, and hopefully see you here in 2 weeks. Thank you so much.